The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds when David pulled his old pickup truck into the dusty parking lot of the Riverside construction site. He sat for a moment, looking at the massive steel beams and concrete foundations that would soon become a 20-story office building. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his hard hat and work boots from the passenger seat. This wasn't how David had imagined his life would look at 35. Just 6 weeks ago, he had been living in Chicago, working as a senior project manager for one of the city's top engineering firms. His corner office had a view of Lake Michigan, and he was making 6 figures designing skyscrapers and bridges. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. His wife had gotten a job offer she couldn't refuse in this small town, and they had decided to make the move together. The only problem was that his professional engineering license wasn't valid in this new state yet. The paperwork was sitting somewhere in a government office, probably buried under a pile of other applications. His lawyer said it could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to get approved. So here he was, about to start his first day as a construction worker. Not a supervisor, not a consultant, just a regular guy with a shovel and a willingness to work hard. David had never been the type to sit around feeling sorry for himself. His father had taught him that honest work was honest work, no matter what kind it was. He walked through the chain-link gate and looked around at the busy construction site. Workers were already scattered across the property, some operating heavy machinery, others carrying materials or setting up equipment. The sound of hammering and drilling filled the air, mixed with the occasional shout of someone calling for help or giving directions. David approached a small trailer that had a sign, reading Site Office on the door. Inside, he found a heavy-set man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes, sitting behind a desk covered in blueprints and coffee-stained paperwork. "You must be David," the man said, standing up and extending a calloused hand. "I'm Bill Rodriguez, the site foreman. Welcome to the team." David shook his hand firmly. "Thanks for giving me a shot, Bill. I know my resume probably looks a little different from your usual hires." Bill chuckled. "Different isn't always bad. We need good people who show up on time and aren't afraid to work. That's what matters most. Around here." He handed David a yellow hard hat and a safety vest. "Let's get you set up and I'll show you around." As they walked across the site, Bill pointed out the different areas and explained what each crew was working on. David found himself naturally understanding the layout and the construction process, but he kept his observations to himself. He was here to learn this job from the ground up, not to show off what he already knew. "We'll start you off with some basic tasks," Bill explained as they stopped near a pile of steel reinforcement bars. "Mixing concrete, moving materials, helping wherever we need an extra pair of hands. Nothing too complicated at first." David nodded. "Sounds good to me. I'm here to work." What Bill didn't mention was that the site had been having some challenges lately. The project was behind schedule, and there had been some tension between the office staff and the construction crews. The engineers who came by from the main office sometimes treated the workers like they were invisible, which created a lot of bad feelings. David spent his first morning learning how to properly mix concrete. It seemed simple enough, but there was actually a science to getting the proportions exactly right. Too much water in the concrete would be weak. Too little, and it wouldn't pour properly. He found himself thinking about the chemical reactions happening in the mixture, the way the cement particles bonded with the water and aggregate to create something stronger than any of its individual components. "You're pretty careful with those measurements," commented Jake, one of the other workers who had been mixing concrete for over 10 years. "Most new guys just dump everything in and hope for the best." David smiled. "My dad always told me that, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right the first time." By lunchtime, David had already made a good impression on several of the crew members. He worked steadily without complaining, asked good questions, and pitched in wherever help was needed. When someone dropped a heavy pipe and couldn't lift it alone, David was right there to help. When the coffee pot in the brake trailer ran empty, he made a fresh pot without being asked. During his lunch break, David sat on a stack of lumber and pulled out his phone to text his wife. "First day going well," he typed. "Different pace than the office, but good people here." She texted back immediately. "Proud of you for making the best of things. Love you. David put his phone away and looked around at his new workplace. In some ways, this felt more real than his old job had. When you're sitting in an office drawing lines on a computer screen, it's easy to forget that those lines represent real steel and concrete, real buildings where real people will work and live. Here, he could see the immediate results of his labor. Every bag of concrete he mixed, every piece of rebar he carried, was directly contributing to something tangible and permanent. The afternoon brought new challenges. David was assigned to help unload a truck full of building materials. The driver was in a hurry and kept rushing everyone to move faster. Some of the younger workers started cutting corners, not properly securing loads or checking weights before lifting. David noticed one pallet that seemed unstable. The strapping looked loose and the materials were shifted to one side. He was about to say something when he caught himself. He was the new guy here. Maybe he should just focus on his own work and not worry about what others were doing. But as he watched one of the workers approach the dangerous pallet with a forklift, David couldn't stay quiet. "Hey, wait a second," he called out. "That load doesn't look secure." The forklift operator stopped and took a closer look. Sure enough, the strapping had partially failed and the materials were about to slide off. If he had tried to lift it, hundreds of pounds of steel could have come crashing down. "Good eye," the operator said, giving David a thumbs up. Could have been a real mess. Word of David's sharp observation spread quickly among the crew. By the end of his first day, several workers had made a point of introducing themselves and thanking him for watching out for everyone's safety. As David drove home that evening, his muscles ached in ways they hadn't for years. His hands were dirty and scratched, and his back was sore from all the lifting and bending. But there was something satisfying about the physical tiredness that came from a day of real work. He thought about his old job, where the biggest physical challenge was walking from his office to the conference room. There had been satisfaction in solving complex engineering problems and managing big projects. But this was different. This was the kind of work that his grandfather had done, the kind that built the backbone of America one brick and beam at a time. David didn't know it yet, but his decision to approach this job with humility and respect was about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and not all of his new co-workers would be as welcoming as the ones he had met today. But for now, he was content to be just another worker heading home after an honest day's work, ready to do it all again tomorrow. 3 weeks had passed since David started working at the construction site, and he had settled into a comfortable routine. He arrived early every morning, worked hard throughout the day, and had earned the respect of most of his co-workers. Bill Rodriguez, the foreman, had started asking for his input on small technical issues, though David was always careful to offer suggestions quietly and humbly. That Tuesday morning started like any other. David was reviewing a set of blueprints that had been left on a makeshift table near the concrete mixing area. The plans showed the foundation details for the building's east wing, and something didn't look quite right to him. The spacing between some of the support columns seemed off, and the load calculations in the margin appeared to have an error. He was studying the numbers more closely when he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw a man in a crisp white shirt, pressed khakis, and a spotless hard hat walking toward him. This had to be one of the engineers from the main office that the other workers had mentioned. The guy carried himself with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance, and his expression suggested he wasn't too pleased about having to visit the actual construction site. The man's name was Richard Stevens, though David didn't know that yet. Richard was 28 years old and had graduated from a prestigious university with an engineering degree. He'd been working for the company for 3 years and had a reputation for being technically competent but difficult to work with. Richard had grown up in an upper-middle-class family and had never done physical labor in his life. To him, construction workers were just muscle, not brains. "Excuse me," Richard said in a sharp tone as he approached David. "What exactly do you think you're doing with those plans?" David looked up, a bit surprised by the hostile tone. "Oh, I was just looking at them. They were sitting here on the table." Richard's eyes narrowed as he took in David's work clothes, dirty hands, and the concrete dust on his boots. "Those blueprints aren't comic books, buddy. They contain complex engineering calculations that take years of education to understand. Several other workers nearby stopped what they were doing and turned to watch the interaction. David felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment, but he kept his voice calm and respectful. I understand. I was just curious about the foundation layout. Curious? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Listen, I'm sure you mean well, but these documents represent thousands of hours of professional engineering work. Why don't you stick to what you know best? Mixing concrete and hauling materials around. Leave the thinking to people who actually went to college. The words stung more than David wanted to admit. He had spent 12 years in college and graduate school, earned multiple degrees, and had designed buildings far more complex than this one. But he simply nodded and said, "You're right. I'll get back to work." As Richard walked away, shaking his head and muttering something about workers who don't know their place, David felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Part of him wanted to speak up, to tell this arrogant young man exactly who he was and what he knew. But a bigger part of him remembered why he was here and what he was trying to accomplish. Jake, the experienced concrete mixer who had befriended David on his first day, walked over with a concerned expression. "Don't let him get to you, man. That guy treats everyone like dirt. He thinks his degree makes him better than all of us." "It's okay," David replied, though his voice was tighter than usual. "He's just doing his job." "No, he's not," said Tony, another worker who had witnessed the exchange. "His job is to make sure this building gets built right and safe. Being a jerk to the people doing the actual work isn't part of that job description." David appreciated their support, but he didn't want to cause any trouble. He had noticed that Richard's behavior was creating tension on the site, but he also knew that complaining about it wouldn't help anyone. Instead, he decided to focus on doing his work as well as possible and staying out of Richard's way. Unfortunately, that proved to be more difficult than he had hoped. Over the next few days, Richard seemed to go out of his way to make David's life miserable. When David was assigned to help organize materials in the storage area, Richard appeared and loudly questioned whether someone with limited reading skills should be handling inventory sheets. When David was working on setting up concrete forms, Richard made a point of explaining basic geometry concepts in a condescending tone, as if David had never heard of right angles before. The worst incident happened on Friday afternoon. David was helping to unload a truck full of steel beams when he noticed that one of the beams had a small crack near one of the weld points. It was barely visible, but David's trained eye caught it immediately. He knew that even a small structural flaw could become a major safety hazard once the beam was under load. He was examining the crack more closely when Richard appeared, apparently having been called over by the truck driver who was impatient to finish unloading. "What's the holdup here?" Richard demanded. "We've got a schedule to keep." David pointed to the crack. "This beam looks like it might have a structural issue. I think we should have it inspected before we use it." Richard barely glanced at the beam before rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on. You're worried about a tiny scratch? That's just surface marking from the manufacturing process. You can't even read a blueprint properly, and now you think you're a metallurgy expert? I really think we should get a second opinion," David said quietly. "Safety should be our first priority." "Safety?" Richard's voice got louder, drawing attention from other workers nearby. "You know what's not safe? Having people who don't understand engineering trying to make engineering decisions. That beam has been certified by qualified professionals. It doesn't need to be inspected by someone whose biggest qualification is knowing how to mix cement." David felt his temper flare, but he took a deep breath and controlled himself. "I'm just concerned about everyone's safety. Maybe we could ask Bill to take a look." "Bill's not an engineer either," Richard snapped. "Look, I don't know what makes you think you have the right to question professional engineering decisions, but I'm telling you right now to back off. Do your job, which is moving heavy things from one place to another, and let the educated people handle the technical stuff." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Several workers were now openly staring, and David could see a mix of anger and sympathy in their faces. They had all grown to respect David over the past few weeks, and seeing him treated this way clearly bothered them. David simply nodded and stepped back. "Understood," he said quietly. As Richard walked away, muttering about workers who don't know their place, Jake came over and put a hand on David's shoulder. That was completely out of line, Jake said. You've got better instincts about this stuff than half the engineers I've worked with over the years. Yeah, agreed Tony. And you know what? I've seen that crack you were talking about. It doesn't look right to me either. David appreciated their support, but he was still stinging from the public humiliation. He had never been spoken to like that in his professional life, and it was harder to take than he had expected. The fact that Richard was probably 10 years younger than him and had a fraction of his experience made it even worse. That evening, as David drove home, he found himself questioning his decision to keep his background secret. Maybe it would be easier to just tell everyone who he really was. But then he thought about his father's advice about earning respect through actions, not titles. He had committed to this path, and he was going to see it through. What David didn't know was that his patience and professionalism in the face of Richard's disrespect had not gone unnoticed. Several of the veteran workers had started talking, among themselves, about the new guy who clearly knew more than he was letting on. And Bill Rodriguez was beginning to suspect that there was more to David's story than met the eye. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything. The days following Richard's public humiliation of David seemed to drag on longer than usual. Word of the incident had spread throughout the construction site, and it was clear that the workers were divided into two camps. Most of them stood firmly behind David, having witnessed his work ethic and genuine character over the past month. But a few of the newer workers seemed intimidated by Richard's authority and kept their distance from David, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to interpret the lack of immediate pushback as validation of his behavior. If anything, his treatment of David became even worse. He would assign David the most unpleasant tasks available, always with a smirk and some comment about keeping people in their proper place. When David was cleaning out a drainage ditch, Richard made sure to walk by and loudly comment about how some people were naturally suited for dirty work. When David was organizing tools in the equipment shed, Richard questioned whether he could handle the complexity of keeping track of different-sized wrenches. But David's response to this treatment was beginning to win him allies in unexpected places. Instead of getting angry or fighting back, he simply did every job with the same careful attention to detail he had always shown. When Richard assigned him to clean portable toilets, David did it thoroughly and without complaint. When he was told to sweep the entire site at the end of each day, David made sure every corner was spotless. More importantly, David continued to quietly notice things that others missed. When he was working near the electrical panels, he spotted some wiring that didn't look up to code. Instead of making a big announcement, he casually mentioned it to Carlos, the head electrician, during a coffee break. Carlos took a look and discovered that a subcontractor had indeed made some dangerous connections that could have caused a fire. "How did you even know to look for that?" Carlos asked David privately later that day. David shrugged. "I just pay attention to details. I guess. My dad always taught me that shortcuts usually lead to bigger problems down the road." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. He had been working construction for 25 years and had developed a good sense for people. There was something about David that didn't quite add up. The way he looked at blueprints, the questions he asked, the things he noticed, it all suggested someone with more knowledge than he was letting on. The turning point came during the third week of Richard's campaign of harassment. The construction site was dealing with a problem that had been plaguing them for days. The concrete for the building's foundation kept coming out with the wrong consistency, despite following the same mixing procedures they had always used. Some batches were too thin, others too thick, and nobody could figure out what was causing the variation. Richard had been called in to solve the problem, and he spent 2 days running tests and adjusting the mix ratios without success. He blamed the concrete suppliers, the mixing equipment, and even the weather, but nothing he tried seemed to work consistently. David had been watching the situation from a distance, and he was pretty sure he knew what was causing the problem. The issue wasn't with the concrete mix itself, but with the water they were using. He had noticed that the water pressure from the site's main line fluctuated throughout the day. which meant that the automatic mixing systems weren't getting consistent amounts of water. But he hesitated to say anything, knowing that Richard would probably just dismiss his observation and make his life even more difficult. On Thursday morning, the problem reached a crisis point. An entire section of foundation had to be torn out and replaced because the concrete had set improperly. The project was now significantly behind schedule, and the company was losing thousands of dollars every day. Bill Rodriguez was standing near the concrete mixing area, looking frustrated and overwhelmed. David was working nearby, moving bags of cement, when he overheard Bill talking to Carlos about the ongoing problems. "I don't understand it," Bill was saying. "We've been mixing concrete the same way for 15 years. This shouldn't be happening." David wrestled with himself for a moment, then made a decision. He walked over to Bill and spoke quietly. "Bill, can I talk to you for a minute? I might have an idea about the concrete problem." Bill looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, what's on your mind?" David explained his theory about the water pressure fluctuations. He suggested that they test the water flow at different times of day and consider installing a pressure regulator or storage tank to ensure consistent water delivery to the mixing systems. Bill listened carefully, asking a few technical questions that David answered with surprising expertise. When David finished explaining, Bill was quiet for a moment. "That actually makes a lot of sense," Bill said slowly. "Why didn't I think of that?" He paused, studying David's face. "How did you figure all that out?" David felt his cheeks warm. "I just noticed the patterns in when the problems were happening. It seemed like it might be related to water usage throughout the site." Bill nodded, but David could see the wheels turning in the foreman's head. "Let's test your theory," Bill said. "If you're right, you might have just saved us a lot of time and money." They spent the next few hours monitoring water pressure and testing concrete batches at different times. Sure enough, David's theory proved correct. When the water pressure was consistent, the concrete mixed perfectly. When it fluctuated, the problems returned. Word of David's solution spread quickly through the crew. By the end of the day, several workers had come by to congratulate him on solving a problem that had stumped everyone else, including the college-educated engineer. Unfortunately, Richard was not pleased when he heard about David's breakthrough. Instead of being grateful for the solution, he seemed to take it as a personal insult. The next morning, he approached David while he was setting up equipment for the day. "I heard you've been playing engineer again," Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Trying to make the rest of us look bad?" David looked up from his work. "I was just trying to help solve the problem. We were losing a lot of time and money." "That's not your job," Richard snapped. "Your job is to do what you're told and keep your opinions to yourself. Just because you got lucky with one guest doesn't make you qualified to make technical decisions." Several workers had stopped their activities to listen to the conversation. David could feel their eyes on him, and he knew that his response would be important. He took a deep breath and chose his words carefully. "You're right that it's not my official job," David said calmly. "But I think everyone here wants this project to succeed. If I notice something that might help, shouldn't I mention it?" "No, you shouldn't," Richard replied firmly. "You should stay in your lane and let the people with actual qualifications handle the technical stuff. I don't care if you think you understand engineering concepts. Understanding and actually being qualified are two very different things." The silence that followed was thick with tension. David could see anger in the faces of several workers who had come to respect him. Jake looked like he was about to say something, but David caught his eye and shook his head slightly. "I understand your position," David said quietly. "I'll be more careful about overstepping in the future." But as Richard walked away, looking satisfied with himself, he didn't notice the expressions on the faces of the workers around him. They had seen David solve a problem that Richard couldn't, and they had watched Richard respond with petty jealousy instead of professional gratitude. Carlos came over to David after Richard was out of earshot. "That guy's got some serious problems," he said. "You just saved this project a ton of trouble, and he acts like you insulted his mother." "He's just doing his job the way he thinks is right," David replied diplomatically. "No, he's not," said Jake, joining the conversation. "His job is to help this project succeed, not to put people down who are trying to help." As the day went on, David noticed something interesting happening. The workers who had witnessed Richard's behavior were starting to talk among themselves. They were sharing stories about David's helpfulness, his knowledge, and his professional attitude in the face of constant disrespect. Meanwhile, they were also talking about Richard's arrogance, his inability to solve the concrete problem, and his apparent jealousy of David's success. Bill Rodriguez was also paying closer attention to the dynamic between David and Richard. He had been in construction long enough to recognize talent when he saw it, and David clearly had technical knowledge that went far beyond what you'd expect from a typical laborer. Bill was beginning to suspect that there was much more to David's story than anyone realized. That evening, as David was packing up his tools, Bill approached him. "David, can I ask you something personal?" Bill said. David looked up, a bit nervous. "Sure. What did you do before you came here? I mean, before construction work?" David hesitated for a moment, then decided to be partially honest. "I worked in an office, did some technical work, but nothing too exciting." Bill nodded, but David could tell he wasn't entirely convinced by the vague answer. "Well, whatever you did, you've got a good head for problem solving. Don't let anyone tell you different." As David drove home that night, he reflected on the events of the past few weeks. Richard's behavior was clearly getting worse. The morning of October 15th started like any other, but it would end up being the day that changed everything at the Riverside construction site. David arrived at his usual time, grabbed his coffee from the brake trailer, and was checking the work schedule when he noticed an unusual amount of activity around the main office trailer. Several expensive-looking cars were parked outside, and people in business suits were walking around with serious expressions on their faces. "What's all the commotion about?" David asked Jake, who was standing nearby, looking concerned. Jake shook his head. "Not sure, but it doesn't look good. I heard something about the city inspectors finding problems with our permits. There's also talk about some big shots from the development company showing up for an emergency meeting." David felt a knot form in his stomach. Permit problems could shut down the entire project, which would mean everyone would be out of work. He had grown attached to this job and these people over the past 2 months, and the thought of the project failing bothered him more than he expected. Around 10 o'clock, Bill Rodriguez gathered all the workers for an announcement. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by obvious stress, and he kept running his hands through his gray hair as he spoke. "Listen up, everyone," Bill said, his voice carrying across the construction site. "We've got a serious situation here. The city engineering department has found some major issues with our structural plans. They're saying our foundation design won't support the load requirements for a building this size." A murmur of worried voices rippled through the crowd of workers. David felt his heart sink. He had suspected there might be problems with the foundation design weeks ago, but he had never gotten the chance to fully investigate his concerns. Bill continued, "The development company executives are here today, and they're not happy. If we can't fix this problem quickly, they might shut down the whole project. That would mean all of us would be looking for new jobs." Richard had been standing off to the side during Bill's announcement, but now he stepped forward with a confident expression. "Don't worry about it," he said loudly. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding with the paperwork. These city inspectors sometimes get confused about complex engineering concepts. I'll straighten it out." But as the morning wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a paperwork problem. David could see through the windows of the office trailer that heated discussions were taking place. People were pointing at blueprints, shaking their heads, and making phone calls. Richard went in and out of the trailer several times, each time looking less confident than before. By lunchtime, the situation had gotten worse. Word spread that the city inspectors were threatening to shut down construction immediately unless the structural problems were fixed. The development company executives were demanding answers, and nobody seemed to have any good solutions. David was eating his sandwich in the brake trailer when Carlos sat down next to him with a worried expression. "This is bad. Really bad," Carlos said quietly. "I've been on projects that got shut down before. Once the city pulls your permits, it can take months to get everything sorted out, if it ever gets sorted out at all." David nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. But more than that, he was feeling frustrated. He was pretty sure he knew what the structural problems were, and he was also pretty sure he knew how to fix them. The question was whether he should speak up or continue to keep his background secret. His internal debate was interrupted when Tony rushed into the brake trailer looking panicked. "They're calling an emergency meeting in the main trailer," Tony announced. "All department heads and senior staff. They want answers, and they want them now." David watched through the trailer window as Bill, Richard, and several other supervisors filed into the meeting. He could see the development company executives inside, along with some people he didn't recognize who were probably from the city engineering department. For the next hour, David tried to focus on his work, but he kept glancing toward the office trailer. He could see animated discussions taking place with people pointing at documents and shaking their heads. At one point, he saw Richard gesturing wildly, apparently trying to explain something to a woman in a navy blue suit who looked increasingly frustrated. Finally, around 2 o'clock, the trailer door opened and Richard came out looking defeated. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by obvious stress and embarrassment. A few minutes later, Bill emerged and walked directly toward David. "David, I need to talk to you," Bill said quietly. "Can you come with me?" David's heart started racing. Had someone figured out his secret? Was he in trouble for keeping his background hidden? He followed Bill toward a quiet corner of the construction site, away from the other workers. "David, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Bill said, looking him directly in the eyes. "What exactly is your background? And don't give me that vague answer about working in an office. I've been watching you for 2 months, and I know there's more to your story." David took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been dreading, but maybe it was also the moment that was meant to happen. "I'm a civil engineer," David said simply. "A licensed professional engineer with 15 years of experience. I've managed projects worth over $50 million. Bill's eyes widened, but he didn't look entirely surprised. "I knew it," he said quietly. "The way you look at blueprints, the questions you ask, the problems you've solved. Why didn't you tell anyone?" David explained about moving to the new state, waiting for his license transfer, and his decision to work construction while the paperwork was being processed. He also explained his father's advice about earning respect through actions rather than titles. Bill listened carefully, nodding as David spoke. When David finished, Bill was quiet for a long moment. "David, I need to ask you a favor," Bill finally said. "We're in serious trouble here. The city engineers are saying our foundation design is fundamentally flawed. Richard has been in that meeting for 3 hours, and he can't come up with a solution. The development company is talking about shutting down the project and suing us for the delays." David felt his stomach drop. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we might all be unemployed by tomorrow," Bill replied. "The woman in the navy suit is Patricia Chen, the vice president of the development company. She's giving us until 5 o'clock to come up with a viable solution, or she's pulling the plug on the entire project." Bill paused, then looked directly at David. "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to take a look at the structural plans? Maybe you can see something that Richard is missing." David didn't hesitate. "Of course. Let me see what I can do." Bill led him toward the office trailer, but stopped just outside the door. "There's one more thing you should know. Richard has been telling everyone that the problems are unfixable, that the entire design needs to be scrapped and started over. That would mean months of delays and millions of dollars in costs." They walked into the trailer, where the atmosphere was thick with tension. Patricia Chen was sitting at the head of a long table covered with blueprints and technical documents. Richard was standing nearby, looking frustrated and defeated. Several city officials were also present, along with other members of the development team. Patricia looked up as Bill and David entered. "Bill, I thought I made it clear that this meeting was for senior staff only." "Ma'am, this is David. He's been working on our crew for the past 2 months, and I think he might be able to help with our structural problems." Richard immediately objected. "Bill, with all due respect, this is not the time to bring in random construction workers. We're dealing with complex engineering issues that require professional expertise." Patricia looked David up and down, taking in his work clothes and dirty hands. I'm sorry, but I don't think this is appropriate. We need qualified engineers, not well-meaning laborers. Bill took a deep breath. Ma'am, David is a qualified engineer. He's a licensed professional engineer with 15 years of experience. The room went completely silent. Patricia's eyes widened and she looked at David with new interest. Richard's face went pale, and David could see the wheels turning in his head as he began to realize what was happening. Is this true? Patricia asked David directly. David nodded. Yes, ma'am. I have a master's degree in civil engineering and I'm licensed in 3 states. I've been working construction while waiting for my license transfer to be approved here. Patricia looked stunned. Why didn't anyone tell me we had a licensed engineer working on the construction crew? Richard found his voice. Even if that's true, he's been working as a laborer. He's not familiar with this specific project. Actually, David said quietly, I've been studying the plans for weeks. I noticed some potential issues with the foundation design, but I wasn't in a position to bring them up officially. Patricia leaned forward in her chair. What kind of issues? David walked over to the blueprints spread across the table. As he began to explain the structural problems he had identified, his years of training and experience became obvious to everyone in the room. He pointed out load distribution issues, identified problems with the reinforcement specifications, and explained why the current design wouldn't meet the city's safety requirements.